Here is Colorverse Red, and I came into this expecting a basic red. It is, but like a faded basic red. In general, it holds in tone as paper changes, and it does shade, which isn't how I tend to prefer my reds. I tend to prefer them more solid. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, I expected better performance since this is part of the Office series. I can't say I'm interested in a bottle. I forced my time using this ink to be because it was just blasé as an experience, not something I really enjoyed.
The pen for today is a Pelikan P200. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Lighter than a basic red, but still a red. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It has some shading, which is not always common for reds. Take a look at rewritten on the second line, where the rewit is a little bit lighter than the TT, which got much darker. The EN at the end lighten up a little bit, but not as far as it was at the beginning of the word. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
More than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks.
Here is Colorverse Extra Dimension. Here is Colorverse Office Gray. Here is Colorverse Clear Cyan. Here is Colorverse Office Permanent Black.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone of faded classic red as we did on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does have little bits of shading that can be found. Look at they make, where in they, the T is lighter than the hey, and in make, the MA is lighter than the KE. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. I believe that to be a result of the paper's tone, meaning that the tone of the paper can affect the tone of the ink that you are getting. So this is a more translucent ink. Feathering, lots of it. And for an ink in an Office series, you would really expect it to do much better on lower quality papers. The spread, no. The shading, yes, but the amount of feathering really, it's almost heartbreaking. Looking at the back of the page, you see that you could not write back here because of the extreme penetration of this ink. Though it did not bleed through touching the page underneath, if it wasn't for that, the ghosting's not a problem. You would be able to, but this just cuts that option out.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade, not as well as on the Clairfontaine, but the shading is there. Look at analyzed, mostly one tone, but the bottom of the bottom of the Z into the ED is just a little bit darker than all the way up to, I'm not going to say it, anally. The anally at the beginning is a lighter tone than the Z at the end. It does stand out against the quad rule, I think, without any kind of a problem, which would make this a decent ink to use on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get a bunch of warning signs as this ink does get very deep into the paper. And I feel like this is an unfortunate thing that's coming up a lot with the Colorverse inks, but it simply is as it is. Now, the ghosting's not a problem. Even these spots, I don't think the spots would stop you from writing on the back of the page, but it is something to be very aware of.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more red inks.
Here is Blackstone Uluru Red. Here is Mont Blanc William Shakespeare. Here is
Pannonia or Dogi Voris. Here is Visconti Bordeaux.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here, the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Not flatter, just lighter in a very, very faded classic red. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It still does shade fairly decent. Look at templates, and you can see that the T is lighter than the EMPL, but the A lightens up a little bit, with test at the end becoming very dark. Decent enough shading. It stands out against the quad rule without any kind of problem, and we are seeing a good performance of this ink on this paper. So if you're a student using this, this paper is a good choice. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Califolio Bon Esperance. Here is Vinta Mother of Pearl Nakar.
Here is Sailor Pennsylvania. Here is Visconti Black.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here, the tone is noticeably lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, almost like a dark pink as a tone on this page. There's very minor feathering. I'm not really concerned with the minor feathering that's going on. There's very minor spread, and again, it's copy paper, so it's not something that's a huge concern to me. There are little bits of shading, which is very nice for what's going on. This might be pretty decent for copy paper. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting's not in itself a problem. It's that deep penetration again that we see so much with these inks. You could not write on the back of this page, though nothing bled through to touch the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Pelikan P200 medium nib is a medium flow writer and gives a faded basic red with touches of shading. Off camera, I tried this in a wet fine, and it did darken and then didn't shade. It became more a true basic red, but not all the way there. But worse, for office paper, the tone and no shading from the wet fine is appealing to me most. But it is important to go with a better paper if that's what you choose to do.